Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak on this panel. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel because it's quite diverse, but very similar when I look at when I listen to the experiences of migration in Mexico and the Arabian Peninsula. So mine is actually to give you some perspectives of what's happening in my region, East Africa, which is the area that I focus on. I will dip into the different regions where I am knowledgeable of the information on migration. I will focus mostly on labor migration because I feel like there's an overfocus on forced displacement in Africa, which kind of creates that perspective that a lot of African nationals are moving because of conflict. But actually the reality is Africans are actually moving because of opportunities that may not be available in their areas. And it's an aspect of exploring where is the closest destination where you can actually gain access to those opportunities. So I will actually also draw attention to what are the myths and realities that we're grappling with as a scholar and a researcher in the region. But I'll also mention some of the changing patterns of migration within the region and focus on the continental, regional, and national response to South-South migration. So I'll just skip that one. So within Eastern Africa, we are quite diverse, and we've had a long history of migration, and this has been tied to our colonial ties. When you look at colonialism, you find that migration was controlled by policies, and these policies actually controlled who migrated, even by gender. You find in Kenya that was colonized by the British, they had, similar to in the Canadian situation, they had native reserves. And the only migrants that could move were men who had a native pass. So that actually limited migration of women, but it didn't mean that women did not migrate. Women migrated and found opportunities to create income-generating opportunities. So what was created in the colonial era in terms of migration became a culture of migration. It became almost like a rites of passage where young men and women were seeking opportunities, and for you to be seen as valuable within the household, you would migrate to contribute to the household economy. You still find nomadic movements of the Dinka, the Nuer in South Sudan, and also the Maasai that cuts across Kenya and Tanzania. But with the recent policies that are being put in place, those nomadic movements are becoming more controlled. And I think it was last year when we had some Maasai pastoralists who had crossed over to the border of Tanzania, and the government of Tanzania confiscated their cattle. So already you can see that certain policies are actually preventing something that has been a natural movement for a historical period of time. So in Africa, we do have mixed migration dynamics. But I always feel, like I mentioned, that we always focus on the displacement question. So just to give you a sense of the different types of migration in East Africa, which is the same in other regions, internal migration is one of the biggest flows, but the aspect that is missing is usually data. And it's because we don't actually have a culture of collecting data on internal migration, and it's quite difficult. We don't actually have a control system that actually tells who to go where. But rural-urban migration is one of the major forms of migration that's happening because of development in urban areas. Rural is still very, it still occurs in many countries, especially those that actually rely on agriculture. Urban is something that is slowly picking up steam, and it's more, you can see it within major cities. In Kenya, it will be Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa. I'm sure everyone knows Mombasa. And then urban-rural is still an emerging movement that is coming, especially with the young people, but most people see it as a retirement space, especially for older migrants. And obviously, forced displacement, human trafficking, labor migration and emigration, and also now, more recently, return migration, which is something amongst the diaspora, which is something that's slowly picking up steam, but again, data is something that we don't actually have. So some of the myths, I know most of the time when I go to meetings and you have this idea that migration is, a lot of African nationals are going to Europe. And the Afrobarometer actually conducted a survey that actually found that majority of the migrants stay within the continent, and it's more regional. So when you look at North Africa, you'll find, I believe it's the pink one, it's North Africans going to Europe, and that's because of their historical relations with Europe. And in the other countries, the green part is other regions, other countries within the region. So that's one aspect you do not see that is actually quite prominent in data, that actually African migrants are more likely to migrate within the continent because of opportunities available within the continent and the cost of migration as well. And this is another data set, supposed to be following my slides. Another data that shows the same information that I was talking about. You can see East Africa inflows. Central Africa is more of cheap labor, and that kind of reflects the way the economy or the political systems operate in that region. So it actually determines the type of migration that actually takes place. So I won't go through that. Another myth is that a lot of the drivers of migration are related to conflict. And if you see the one with the orange, with all the orange colors, most of them are seeking employment. So we need to understand that not all migrants are actually running from conflict-related situations. They are migrants that are seeking income-generating opportunities that may not be available in their communities, or their environment are not conducive to actually absorb them. Another aspect that was key, and in many countries, is poverty, and this poverty is more related in the rural areas, but we also do have urban poverty, which is sometimes set aside when we don't look at the facts and we don't have evidence to actually connect the dots. As I mentioned, the patterns of migration are actually changing, and you find that obviously the economic is the main driver. And the existing research presents a picture that youth need to be focused on the immediate economic gratification. Young people are looking for quick jobs that give them quick money that meet their immediate needs. But right now, the policies that are related to migration don't actually capture this aspect because it's actually changing. Youth migration dynamics in Kenya is very different from youth migration dynamics in Malawi, and that is basically what we need to unpack. And another aspect that we're seeing is gender is key to understand. The assumption that all young people, all young men and women are migrating for the same reasons and for the same aspects is actually untrue if you unpack the data and the evidence, because you find that young women are migrating, they may be leaving their children behind with their family members, but they're still economically giving back, and they're more likely to contribute to the family that has left behind. So we need to actually try to capture more evidence and data to change our perspectives on how we address migration, and that's in terms of policy and practice. I realize the time is running. So one of the aspects that we were looking at was youth employment and migration. And this is a multi-country study that we're doing in Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, and Zambia. So the reality is migrants are mostly internal, but we do have regional migrants that are actually migrating. Young people are looking for more self-employment opportunities as opposed to employed opportunities, which are sort of limiting. And there's this aspect of the digital era and disconnecting with certain sectors which are not so digitized, and this change of way of working that young people want more freedom to actually earn their right to some form of income. And also the life stage of a youth determines whether you move or stay. This is obvious because married people are more likely to stay in one area and single people are more likely to move. But actually you find that it's actually more depends on needs. So if there's a family that is left behind, there'll be a family that's married, the main migrant will move, but will still be facilitating and sending money and income resources to their family. And it's just based on the economy in the country. So why South-South migration? I think it's really important for us to focus on it, and especially in Africa, it's really under-researched. And it's something that we need to understand it from different lenses. And we understand it differently from where I operate, and it's an aspect of need. If policymakers are interested in understanding South-South migration dynamics and how it influences policy, and not at a national level on its own, we also need to understand how it affects at a decentralized level, so at county level or district level. Also, tapping on what Sylvia talked about, media is key in terms of shaping public perceptions about South-South migration. And these days, actually, you don't need a network to actually migrate to another country. You just use social media as an information hub. So how can we actually understand how that actually informs different migration patterns in the region and actually changes the way policy even operates? And why is it important? I mean, migration contributes to development. I think we've talked a lot about it, but I feel like we're kind of shifting it to more on a security lens, even in Africa. So countries need to learn or try to understand their migration dynamics to harness the benefits of migration within their countries, within the region, and within the continent. So in terms of continental response, there are different frameworks. At African Union level, they've developed guiding principles, and the migration policy framework for Africa is one of the tools that they developed in 2006. And it's very similar to the GCM, the one for safe and orderly and regular migration. The only challenge had been implementing it or encouraging countries to mainstream it into their national policies and practices. This framework has recently been revised in 2018. And now the African Union is taking an active role of creating greater awareness of how countries can actually, one, develop their own national migration policies, and the regional economic communities also develop their own migration policy frameworks. And that will allow more synergies, more coordination on migration aspects. The limitations are based on individual country needs, and you find that some of them may not have an interest in migration, so it's about convincing them of why they need to understand migration. And the issue has been always focusing on migration as a problem. When you focus on migration as a problem, then your policies are shaped as problematic. So that's one of the aspects that I've observed based on my engagement with the process. And also at a national level, is convincing them how migration actually benefits them as a country, as a region, as a continent. And this is why when the African Union is talking about African Free Continental Trading Area and the Free Movement Protocol, there has to be a buy-in, member state level and REC level. So this is just an image for you to see the different RECs. There are 8 of them. And in those 8, you find we are multiple. So Kenya is somewhere in the middle there. Kenya is a member of East African Community, COMESA, which is the part of Southern Africa and Eastern Africa Agreement. It's more of an economic agreement, and it's also part of IGAD. So imagine trying to manage, migration, and you're all members of these RECs. And you can find ECOWAS has 15 members, ECAS, which is in North Africa, has 11, COMESA has 19. SADC has 16, EAC has 6, and IGAD has 8. We all have mixed migration flows. So we need to really understand how can we harness it and how can we capitalize it and understand our migration flows. Data is important for doing that. An understanding of how migration actually benefits us as a nation, as a region, as a continent would be key. So I think I will not proceed with my next slides because I feel like the time is up, but I'll be more willing and able to take any responses that anyone may have, or any questions. Thank you very much.